Okay, so hello and welcome back. So today we'll be talking about the Rocky Mountain rocket, which was one of the Rock Island's fleet of rockets that it fielded across its system. The rockets, as mentioned in their previous video, were the premier trains of the Rock Island Railroad. The Rocky Mountain rocket was their train between Chicago and Denver via Omaha, with a section to Colorado Springs. Seeing as how the Rock Island ran very few overnight trains, I would hazard a guess that the Rocky Mountain rocket was one of the few trains that could be considered one of their flagship trains. The Golden State was also kind of in that boat as well as I think the Twin Star rocket. But as far as the Golden State becoming a full flagship train, the SP kind of killed that one off because they were cheap. Normally, this is when I would go through the long history of how the railroad in question, in this case the Rock Island, was built, but there really isn't much to say about how they made it to Colorado. At least there doesn't seem to be too much recorded about the history of this route. The route started out as the Chicago, Kansas, and Nebraska Railroad, which was created by a man named Marcus Lowe, who was a lawyer for the Rock Island. His firm or employer advanced him $25 million to start the construction of the new route that would eventually extend to Colorado along the Chisholm Trail. Chisholm, I'm not entirely sure how to pronounce that. And all the way into Texas. All in all, this railroad laid 1,400 miles of track before its demise in 1891. The railroad did well for its first few years and eventually hit hard times. Since the Rock Island was the main company that loaned them money, they foreclosed on them and incorporated the Chicago, Kansas, and Nebraska Railway into the Rock Island proper in 1891. Also, another note is that the Rock Island actually had access to Denver over the UP and Rio Grande over trackage rights, which was, from what I have been digging into the Rock Island's history, is actually kind of a pattern for them, that they didn't always have direct access to all the cities they served. The Rocky Mountain rocket was launched in 1939 after the Rock Island had launched other trains under the rocket name in the previous years. The original rockets were entirely daytime trains that ran between various cities in the Midwest, such as Chicago to Omaha via Des Moines, Kansas City to Minneapolis, Fort Worth to Houston. These trains were similar to the other trains of the day, like the Coast Daylight, or as I mentioned in that video, a similar vein being the modern Amtrak state-supported routes. And I mentioned this more in the general video on the subject of the Rock Island rocket, so hopefully it'll either be linked on the side or I will remember to link it, but given my track record with this, probably not. Seeing the success of the existing rockets, the Rock Island wanted to launch an overnight train, so they decided to run an overnight train between Chicago and Denver. This train also had cars that ran from Kansas City and a section that went through to Colorado Springs. The original cars that were put into the Rocky Mountain rocket were cars from Pullman and Budd, which included 2 chair cars, which are basically modern long-distance coaches, a 10-section 4-roomette sleeper, a diner and observation car that went to Denver, and a chair car, club car, 8-section, 2 double-bedroom, 2-compartment sleeper for Colorado Springs. Mind you, this was all streamlined equipment. This wasn't heavyweight equipment as far as I can tell, but we'll get into more of that in a second. Since we're kind of in the Denver-centric train routes, this was a very competitive market, the Chicago-Denver route. They were competing against the Burlington, which at this point I don't think had launched the Denver Zephyr yet, but they were competing against all their trains. The UP, by this point, did have the city of St. Louis and the city of Denver running. The Missouri Pacific was also running the Colorado Eagle from St. Louis. The rocket managed to hold its own against the UP and the Burlington, even with a 3-hour longer run. The rocket left Chicago's LaSalle Street Station at 1:55 p.m. and arrived in Denver Union Station at 8:30 the next morning. This was a pretty standard service for the day. The Rock Island, much like the SP trains, were never really a cutting-edge service, or at least when it came to their passenger trains. The SP did have its daylights, but that was basically it as far as like high-class trains go, and that kind of pains me to admit that, since the SP is one of my more favorite railroads, but yeah, that's just something that we'll leave for another day. Also note that the rocket was using cars mostly with sections at a time when they were quickly becoming the old style of sleeping accommodation, which is another thing that just kind of shows that the Rock Island was a little bit behind the 8 ball on changing trends in transportation. Also, this route was a good way to summarize the Rock Island as a railroad and how it worked in a general sense. The UP and Burlington had connections from Denver further west, and the UP ran the city of St. Louis, the Portland Rose, Pacific Limited, to places such as Los Angeles, San Francisco, and Portland. The Burlington ran trains north of Denver to meet the Northern Pacific and Great Northern in Montana, and a train through to California over the Rio Grande and Western Pacific. Last connection is also mentioned in a Missouri Pacific schedule as being the connection it recommended for passengers to reach San Francisco. They ran the Scenic Limited with the Rio Grande and Western Pacific, and the Burlington ran the Exposition Flyer, which two different trains, which I think at some point were combined. Anyways, we'll get into that on the California Zephyr video, so we're not gonna microanalyze that now. Anyways, most of the railroads at this point would show on its passenger maps what were the preferred routes for someone to take from one end of the system to a major city on a different system. For the Rock Island, its preferred way to get from Chicago to San Francisco was to go all the way to LA on the Golden State and then up the San Joaquin Valley or the coast route to the Bay Area. This was a semi-inconvenient route, even though the Santa Fe did this with its train, the San Francisco Chief, as well as other trains like the Golden State, the Grand Canyon and the Navajo, and I think the Scout also had connections up the Central Valley as well. This gives the impression to me, at least, that the Rock Island Railroad was very much kind of like an island compared to the other Granger neighbors, such as the Chicago Northwestern and the CB&Q. The Chicago Northwestern was well integrated with its partner, the Union Pacific, and the Hill Lines were basically a giant syndicate. Since the Rock Island showed the SP as the only westward connection to California, this just shows that the SP was very much the Rock Island's biggest partner, yet there were never serious merger talks. But that's also going to be kind of a plug for whenever I do the video on the what went wrong with the Grangers, which may already be out by the time I release this. I don't really know yet. Actually, it might be the next video. Who knows? Anyways, the Rocky Mountain Rocket did face a decline like other trains of the era did. Since the Rock Island schedule was 2 to 3 hours longer than the competing City and Zephyr trains, so between Chicago and Denver, it wasn't the preferred train, other than for people who got on and off in the middle and people who were riding to primarily Colorado Springs. Since for a good chunk of its history, Colorado Springs wasn't only directly served by the Rock Island for Chicago. The Burlington ended up adding service when it re-equipped the Denver Zephyr in the 50s, though. But running a much slower schedule with a generally older style of equipment didn't help them with the advent of planes and better highways. This led to the decline of the Rocky Mountain Rocket, which was fairly quick, and the train was canceled in 1966, and it lost its sleepers 15 months earlier, which meant that this was a coach and snack bar only operation for its last 15 months and was an overnight train, so yeah, not very good. And as I mentioned in the last video on the Rock Island, it pretty much lost all of its passenger services between 1966 and 1969, which I kind of found interesting that it mostly maintained its system and then just went in one shot, more or less. Anyways, let's just talk briefly about the food service on the Rock Island. It was always less fabulous compared to the Santa Fe with its Fred Harvey service and the Union Pacific dining service. Looking at a menu from before World War II, they do have 6 entree options and a full 2-page menu in the dining car for dinner. Comparing this to services in the mid-60s, the diner menu basically just fits on one page and includes steak, lamb chocks, ham and egg as entrees, and a bunch of cheaper options such as salads and sandwiches. The lunch menu from around the same time includes a sausage and mashed potato dish and a fillet of fish dish. Other than that, the menus seem more like a deli menu than a proper streamliner. And mind you, these are menus for the Golden State, which was more or less their flagship train even in the middle of the 60s. You can tell that the railway was in fast decline, and even then it was still, before when it was in its height, it was still a comparable service, but it wasn't, or not comparable, but competent service, but it wasn't the, first-class flagship that the Super Chief or the City of Los Angeles would have been, which very much just shows that it wasn't the major competitor to the Burlington and Union Pacific trains along the same route. Which brings us to the route today. With the bankruptcy of the Rock Island in 1980, and a lot of its mileage was lost in the bankruptcy, most notably the Choctaw route, but it lost other parts of its network too. For the Rocky Mountain Rocket, the segment between Lincoln and Hallam, which I believe is in Kansas, I didn't write down what state that's in, was abandoned along with a section between Fairbury and Bellevue Belleville, geez, I can read, which I believe are in Kansas and going up into Nebraska, which means there really is no way to revive this route if Amtrak wanted to. But just like with the Rock Island, or why the Rock Island routes didn't survive, there were just better routes between Chicago and Denver that made more sense with what services did survive. And if Amtrak were to add more services, adding more trains along the existing Zephyr route would just make more sense and be cheaper. So it's one of those things. Anyways, I will leave this here. Since this is a shorter video, I actually am planning on releasing a video on Denver Union Station just for the sake of adding something, because this is a very short video, even by this channel standard, so that'll either be out later today or sometime in the next few days or next week or so after this. So yeah, sorry about that, and hopefully the Granger analysis history video will also be out sometime soon by the time this video releases. Anyways, I hope you did enjoy, and I will see you in the next one.